where the local industries originally emerged, but then there would be congestion. So if you wanted to continue to avail yourself of cheap water power, you often had to move out of the country. That's where the cheap water was. But if you opted for a steam engine, you could stay in the city, and that had the great benefit of keeping you in touch with the reserve army of unemployed workers in the cotton industry that developed in the 1820s and 30s. And the second major advantage, quite similar to the steam power, was its freedom in time. So water wheels were integrated into the natural cycles of the weather, which meant that if you had, for instance, a dry spell in the summer, the water level in the river might go so low that the wheels slowed down or even came to a stop. The same could happen if the river froze in a cold Scottish winter week, for instance. Renewable energies, and this is the same today, are integrated in the fluctuations of the weather in the currently existing landscape, whereas fossil fuels are legacies from past photosynthesis that have been stored under the ground for hundreds of millions of years and have no relation whatsoever to what's happening on the surface of the planet, to the time, to the space of currently existing landscapes. They are detached from it, and they enter these landscapes by means of human labor. Once they are inside the landscapes, they can be put anywhere. So once you have dug up a ton of coal, you can, in theory at least, you can transport it anywhere and use it at any site of your choosing. And likewise with time, you can burn the coal and run your steam engine whether it rains or freezes. It has no relation to the weather on the surface. And this was a tremendous advantage for factory owners, particularly when the working day was limited. I mean, I could go into this for a long time. I'm going to leave it there, but it accorded a much greater flexibility in time and space for capitalists than what continuing use of the cheaper prime mover would have done. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Do some of it, the steam engine corresponded to a better timing, the one of capitalism, which is basically the continual movement of valuation of value, and with a steam engine you could actually try to end your production on a constant basis, so you use the time for maximum preservation of surplus value, so you do not depend on weather events and context. So in these developments and the problems that could arise from the Anthropocene concept, at least the critical needs to qualify it in precise, more precisely. You try to forge the concept of what you call fossil capital, maybe like you call it the production of exchange value and the maximization of profit by the means of fossil energy as a necessary material substrate, meaning that you try to encompass inside of the definition of Marx, the Marxian definition of capital, the use of fossil fuel, and you use it as the concept to qualify the enemy, because this is kind of the moment when you define it, and it is a concept that you use with all of your work today. So maybe you could tell us about this concept and then what was the aim of forging it and naming it this way?
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to do here was, of course, to simply apply the classical categories from Marxian political economy, the ones defined in the book Capital, and use these concepts to try to understand what happened and what still happens. Then fossil capital, I mean, it's basically just a general definition of capital from Marx, but pasted onto the particular material of fossil fuels. So it's the production, the self-expansion of value on the basis of fossil fuels. it's just a traditional Marxian definition of capital fused with one particular material.
But, okay, so now maybe we could talk, because timing is already quite short, we could talk about now let's say the political consequences of a world that is driven by fossil capital. And you are working right now on the idea that we should analyze the different climate negotiation of nowadays and try to understand how they basically failed deeply, and try maybe to understand what can we say about this feeling that everybody knows now, but the rate of awareness about the situation is quite high, and everybody knows that we are like running towards apocalyptical fire, and why still the system of negotiation is failing, and maybe can guide us through the different steps of this negotiation as you've been working lately on, from the Kyoto Protocol to Paris Agreement, and how systematically the logic of fossil capital, has been an obstacle for any kind of resolution on the political level.
Oh yeah. There's so much to say. Could go on for a long time. Well, if we start on the question of negotiations, I think their degeneration is quite spectacular. Although you could say that there was some progress at the latest COP, number 28, in the UAE, when for the first time the notion of a phase out of fossil fuels entered into the actual text that came out of that COP. This is, of course, to be welcome. What it means in practice is extremely unclear. The trend that we've been seeing now is that COP27 was in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. COP28 was in the United Arab Emirates. COP29 will be in Azerbaijan. And all of these are fossil fuel producers. Egypt is a little bit different, but Egypt under Sisi is essentially a semi-colony of the Gulf in terms of its political economy, at least. And all of these three are highly authoritarian states where it's impossible for social movements to organize and contest what's going on inside these summits. And it's quite, it cannot really be a total coincidence that we have 3 COPs at a very critical juncture in time, namely when we're on the threshold of 1.5 degrees of warming, placed in those locations. And the trend in recent COPs, and this started already in Glasgow, goes back further than that, of course, but the trend which was most pronounced at the most recent COP is that oil and gas companies are aggressively present in these COPs and pursuing an agenda that says we are going to continue with fossil fuels, and the problem isn't fossil fuels as such. The problem is the CO2 that is emitted when you burn fossil fuels, but these two can be detached, or you can close the loop. So if you look, for instance, at what's going on in the Gulf countries, you have Saudi Arabia as a good case. This is a research project that I hope to be able to spend some time on in the next few years, because these countries are becoming so prominent. So Saudi Aramco is the world's largest oil company. And in 2022, it made profits that might have been the largest profits ever made by a company in the entire history of world capitalism. This being in 2022, when we're just about to hit 1.5 degrees of global warming. And last year, they again made astronomical profits, not as astronomical as in 2022, but they keep making these incredible profits, even though oil and gas prices went down a little bit during 2023 compared to where they were in 2022. And Saudi Aramco is now undertaking its largest capex, capital expenditure project ever, which means expanded investment in oil and gas. So they have no intention, just like no other oil and gas company, Total being very much the obvious case. Here, the single largest private company headquartered in this country, no intention to leave fossil fuels underground. In fact, a leading Saudi official, I don't remember exactly who it was, said that every molecule of hydrocarbon will be taken out. This is, and Equinor in Norway says exactly the same thing. So this isn't anything unique to Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is just the largest of the oil corporations. And they have quite imaginatively and effectively picked up the idea of a circular carbon economy and started investing in, and they were early with this, research on and some projects for removing CO2 out of the air. Now, this is still on an extremely limited scale, and I would argue that the key function of it is ideological and not anything of any material substance. But when they speak of a circular carbon economy, what they mean is that we can continue with the fossil fuels as we've always done and keep making these insane profits. But once the CO2 is out in the atmosphere, we're going to capture it through direct air capture or some other negative emissions technology, and then recycle this carbon and use it for the production of various commodities that we can then further sell. So we close this loop, and thereby we can continue with fossil fuels because the CO2 that's released will be taken out again. This is the kind of discursive trick that is being played here. There are tons of problems with this, and we can unpack them if you're interested in it. It's what I'm working on right now with my colleague. But this is rising to the surface, and one way of understanding this is that all efforts to limit fossil fuel production so far have failed. And everything that has been done in all the UN negotiations and other kinds of climate initiatives, everything has failed in the sense that there has been no limit imposed on the extraction and production of fossil fuels, with tiny, tiny exceptions here and there. Most particularly in Latin America, the only continent where the left still has the ability to seize state power and do certain progressive things. Just to reconnect to some of the themes we've spoken about so far. In the past few years, we've had, particularly since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, and particularly during 2022, seen these absolutely extraordinary profit bonanzas. Along the lines of what I mentioned with Saudi Aramco, where all these big oil and gas companies, BP, Shell, Total, Exxon, Chevron, have recorded the largest profits in their entire history. And these profits they have used to double down on fossil fuels. Most spectacular in the case of BP, which used these historical profits in 2022 as a reason to shut down its solar and wind portfolio, because they don't make any money out of it. So they are committing themselves to even more expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, even more drilling, even more pipeline, exactly the kind of things that we can. And to then go back to the question of the Anthropocène, with which you started, it's pretty evident here that these kind of decisions are not taken by humanity as a whole, or on behalf of humanity. These decisions that are made in boardrooms about what energy source to invest in, are decisions made by people whose sole goal is to maximize profit. And they make these decisions because they have a position as owners of means of production. So they have capital, and with this capital they can decide on what energy source to bet. So you can discuss the role of humanity as such in the beginning of the crisis, and you can discuss where humanity is right now when we're seeing the crisis, running completely out of control. And I think that in both cases, in my view, it is evident that the key decisions have been made by very small subsections of our species. And right now, obviously, some parts of the species are already suffering destruction because of these decisions. And it's not a bold prediction to say that this summer of 2024 will see another round of extreme climate disasters around the world, because this happens every summer and it gets worse and worse and worse. Now, we've all been preoccupied by the genocide in Gaza that started in October, and it's quite fascinating because there was the worst single climate disaster recorded in the past decade happened on September 11 in Libya, when 11,500 people were killed overnight in flash floods that were directly caused by global warming. And that was kind of a combination of the summer of 2023 as a season of climate disasters. But since then, the headlines have been completely dominated by the genocide in Palestine, for obvious reasons. I predict here, and it's not a spectacular prediction, that in the summer there will be new mega disasters. I don't think the disaster in Palestine will by any means be over by then, but there will be new mega disasters fueled by extreme heat, and they will hit the headlines again, and we will spend much of this summer worrying about totally extreme weather events circling around the world. And this is bringing us, we are, so when COP 21 happened in this city in 2015, the conclusion that came out of that COP was that we cannot have global warming over 1.5 degrees. It said, we're going to, it should be somewhere between 1.5 and 2, but with the IPCC special report in 2018, it was kind of confirmed that the aim of the international community should be to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, right? Last year was the warmest on record, and it was 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial baseline. We just had a February, that was the hottest February on record. It was 1.56 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial baseline. So we are on that threshold, and we are passing it, and we are moving into a phase of climate disaster precisely that we should have avoided according to the consensus that emerged by the time of Paris. And this will cause extreme amounts of suffering in the next few years, and it will happen particularly in the global south. And it will lead to, it is already leading to climate politics shifting its focus towards what is sometimes referred to as overshoot management. Okay, so what are we going to do when we're overshooting 1.5? We have to manage this somehow. Well, there are three things we can do. We can try to adapt. We can try to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and I can talk a lot about that because that's what's mostly in my head right now. Or we can do solar geoengineering. And Switzerland just the other week made a major push for a focus on solar geoengineering, and I think this is also, well, it already is coming very much into focus. So because of this epic failure to rein in fossil capital, we found ourselves in a period of these recurring climate disasters that are bound to get worse. There is no way they cannot get worse as long as this fire is out of control. And then people will panic and look for various things to somehow try to get these things under control. So there will be more talk about adaptation, mega basin, or sea walls, whatnot, and there will be there is hysteria for carbon dioxide removal, and there will be more and more talk about soil geoengineering, and I'm afraid I will have. This was a long rant, I'm sorry, but these are just some of the few things that need to be unpacked.
No, but it's interesting. One of the examples you give of this kind of conscious strategy of not cutting fossil fuel is the fact that, for example, we have different example of cooperation, international cooperation, to fix the climatic problem. And the example is the one of the ozone layer, where you had like very binding measures to take. And that actually what you show is in different negotiations, there was a race towards not having binding measures, in order to take out any kind of constraint on fossil fuels. And I thought that what's interesting is that you say that, okay, now we know people are responsible. These people are a minority. They are the specific class, dominant classes, but also in terms of the global south, it means that continuing this idea of overshooting the carbon budget is a death sentence for a lot of people in the south. You maybe wrap on how, because the 1.5% degree was something kind of victory of the south, global south, inside the negotiations. You come back from this kind of victory of the southern global south to impose a 1.5% degree, and how it came to the overshooting strategy.
Yeah, you know, our world is, despite talk about the contrary, very much fundamentally structured by the division between the global south and the global north. This is again becoming extremely visible during the ongoing genocide, when the support for the state of Israel that we find is in the north, and the support for Palestine is in the south. The contrast is extremely stark. When it comes to climate negotiations, you actually have a similar structure, and it's been there for a long time, with some significant exceptions, of course. You know, countries like Iran, for instance, not to mention Saudi Arabia. I don't know if we should even include Saudi Arabia in the global south, but these countries have been extremely reactionary in the climate negotiations. But broadly, it's been a south versus north contest from the beginning. And in 2015 here in this city, I don't know how many of you were here during the COP, but in the history of climate politics, what happened in Paris in 2015 was and will remain absolutely central. It was a key moment for various different reasons. And when it comes to the 1.5 degree target that was for the first time entered into the text in Paris, that was exclusively a result of campaigning from countries in the global south. It started with the Alliance of the Small Island States, who raised the slogan 1.5 to stay alive, and this then spread in the countries from the global south in the negotiations, and was picked up by the social movements that were active in the streets here during the negotiations. And an enormous momentum was built behind this demand that the global north tried to resist, including the French presidency of the negotiations, and of course the US. But in the end, it became impossible to resist this demand. There was, however, the other, and unfortunately, tragically, more important aspect of the Paris Summit and the Paris Agreement that made this a real turning point in climate politics was that Paris killed the notion of mandatory emissions reductions, which had been the premise for all negotiations, all the agreements, the Kyoto Agreement most notably. And after Kyoto, the general expectation, at least in the global south, up until another decisive COP, namely the one that happened in Copenhagen, if I've made mistakes in mentioning the correct, the correct COP numbers and cities, I apologize, but there's so many of them now that it's difficult to keep all of them in mind. COP21 was here, COP15 was in Copenhagen in 2009. That was when, I don't know if you remember, there was a complete debacle towards the end of that COP when Barack Obama suddenly proposed this idea that we're going to have no mandatory reductions. It's all going to be voluntary, which means that any country can freely choose how or if they want to cut their emissions, and then by how much, to what date, and so on. And the Global South just freaked out, and this was why the Copenhagen summit just fizzled out into a general, embarrassing, disgraceful anticlimax. Paris was the summit where this notion was enshrined, and it's now the basic foundation of all climate negotiations, that you come and say on a voluntary basis as a government what you aim to do without any kind of obligation to actually do this thing that you say that you want to do. So essentially laissez-faire. Do what you want if you want to do something. This was an absolute disaster. And the Global South resisted it for as long as it could, but it failed in the end. What it got instead in Paris was the 1.5 degree target. However, the Global North already had a kind of a method to absorb that concession, which was the idea of overshoot, that had become prominent and that actually partly came out of my country, Sweden. Overshoot being the idea that, okay, we can say we are aiming for 1.5 degrees. This doesn't mean that warming will never go beyond 1.5. It means we can let warming go beyond 1.5 and then return to 1.5 later in the century by means of rolling out negative emissions technology. And the technology that was in focus in Paris, or around the time of Paris, is a Swedish invention called BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And the idea here, stop me if I go too far, because
That's fine.
The idea here is, okay, we have to have a technology for drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. Well, trees do this naturally. They capture CO2 through photosynthesis. But then they just stand there. And they don't necessarily capture more CO2 when they've grown up and they're a mature forest. However, if you plant a fast-growing forest of something like eucalyptus or poplar or some other tree that grows fast, you let them reach peak absorption of CO2, you cut them down, you transport them to a power plant, you use them as biomass in the power plant, you burn them as a fuel to drive a generator. It could be coal, it could be gas, and it could be biomass. It's the same process. You get electricity out of this, but you put your hand on the column of smoke and you stick into it a chemical element that captures the CO2 and lead it away. So you can isolate the CO2 and you can purify it, you can liquefy it, and you can inject it under the ground in some kind of cavity, for instance an empty, depleted old oil and gas well. And if you repeat this, you put new seedlings of eucalyptus from that plantation, and you again capture CO2 and you harvest them. You get a loop. You get a pump that pumps CO2 from the atmosphere back into the ground. Now, this technology, which pretty miraculously entered climate models and papers in the years around 2007, 8, 9, 10 and up to Paris, offered policymakers a way to both miss and hit the 1.5 degree target. It said that we can overshoot 1.5, but towards the end of the century, we're going to have all of these BECCS plantations that draw CO2 down, so we go back to 1.5. Do you see, you follow this argument? Now, one of the fascinating aspects of this was that when Paris happened, there was a single BECCS plant in operation in the entire world.
You could do unicorn, like
in Illinois. Today, as we speak, in 2024, there is still a single BECCS plant in operation in the entire world in Illinois. So, the idea that we can exceed 1.5 degree and go back pivots on a technology that still exists in only one location in the world. Now, there might be new BECCS plants that's about to be established, one actually in Sweden, which is the homeland of this idea, one of our wonderful gifts to the world, and maybe one in Yorkshire as well. But what we've seen since, because Bex has some very, very obvious problems. One is, where are you going to get the land from to establish all of these plantations? That's going to suck the CO2 out of the air. It takes enormous amounts of land to have these eucalyptus plantations, or whatever it's going to be. Some would say, some have estimated that you would need to devote as much land as all the land that is currently devoted to agriculture to Bex for it to do this kind of work. Where do you get this land from? Well, there's a new paper out that says that one way of actually acquiring this land is to shift populations away from meat and dairy products. That's the kind of land reserve we have. If we stop having livestock, then we can have our eucalyptus trees instead. I'm personally in favor of this, but I'm not sure it's going to be an easy sell for people to stop eat meat and dairy and instead see these Bex plantations. And this is just one typical instance of the kind of secondary conflicts that you will see play out after the failure to rein in CO2 emissions. Okay, I'm talking too long, but this is just a universe of difficulties and problems. A mess such as, it doesn't stop, and we'll live with it for the rest of our lives, that's for sure.
Yeah, meat and dairy products, you probably lose friends in the matter very quickly. But there's another argument that you say is that the problem of this kind of overshooting conjuncture or strategy is that it's also a bet on the future, meaning that we can think about the subject as if there will not be consequences to a warming weather in the next few years. And with a warming weather, a global warming level reaching above 1.5% and so on, the condition of production would not be the same as in the world before. And that again, I felt like in your last work that was very interesting to see how, like here, the ideological conception of the people who have the problem of the means of production in fossil carbon industries and the interest of global mankind is very different. And let's maybe, before having one question from the audience, because it's a lot of subject, having a more, let's say, optimistic political discussion, because in your work you're also very, I don't know how to say that, you're ready to say, okay, now we know the enemy, it's the fossil capital. We know that we need to strike it in a normal way, in a political way, but there's a very great development about how the problem of the fossil industry is that first they have a lot of fixed capital. Like they have very heavy machines, pipelines, logistics that makes them exposed, meaning they're weak. The capital is always weak when it is materialized with its materialistic fixed position that it is. And in the fishing industry, it's a huge struggle, but already started, especially in the global south, against the expansion, but also because the level of fixed capital is so high, it is always linked with financial capital in some matters. And so the question of the, I'm going with this, the asset stranding of the fossil economy is one objective. It's the core of the struggle that we have to resume against the fossil economy, against the fire. Could you maybe link us the different forms of capital and how, from the fossil industry, you could visualize how deep and how big the enemy is, the one that lit the fire, maybe?
Yeah, you know about the EPOC, the East African ECOP, the East African crude oil pipeline. Yeah, that
Total is building in West Africa.
Yes. Now, this is exactly the kind of carbon bomb that has to be diffused, meaning it's actually going to kill a lot of people, because at this late hour, when the atmosphere is already saturated with CO2, to take up more fossil fuels and set them on fire, of course all fossil fuels that's taken up are immediately set on fire. You don't store oil for years or decades. It's not like guns that you can keep in your basement and then they just rust or whatever. These weapons are actually immediately used as soon as they're sold. Because of this situation, to build a pipeline like this is to prepare for mass killing, even though it's totally indiscriminate, it's blind, but everyone knows that producing fossil fuels of these amounts at this moment in history would have been different in 1924 when the atmosphere wasn't yet overfilled with CO2, but in this moment in history, it is a form of violence. It's exactly what we can't have. It's a carbon bomb. It needs to be diffused. So any kind of meaningful mitigation means that a project like ECO has to stop. But assume now that the pipeline is constructed, and assume that this has happened with the mobilization of a lot of finance from various banks. Now there have been successful campaigns against banks that have forced quite a few of them to drop their funding of the pipeline. I'm not fully up to date here. I don't know how many banks are still involved. Maybe someone can fill me in. Are there 3 banks now? Is the Japanese one? Yeah, I'm not sure. But let's just imagine for the sake of the argument that there are several banks that have put a lot of money into a construction project of this kind. This is normally the case because these huge fossil fuel infrastructure projects require enormous initial investments that can only happen if these companies draw on capital from their shareholders, that's the logic of the joint stock company, or from banks. So they take out loans from banks to mobilize the capital necessary for these initial investments. And so Total builds ECO. And then 1 month after its inauguration, there is a decision by the French state or some other relevant institution to shut down this pipeline because we have to mitigate climate change. We have to do something. We have to get this problem under control. That would be an absolute financial disaster for Total, which then will have mobilized so much money that just goes to waste. Because if this pipeline isn't allowed to operate, then of course these investments can't be recuperated and there will be no profit. And the same thing for the banks that have put money into the pipeline. If the pipeline is closed down a month after its inauguration, these banks won't get their debts honored. They won't be the outstanding capital that they have and they're expecting to get back with the rent will be lost. You see the logic? This is the logic of stranded assets or asset stranding. And the logic is that if mitigation ever starts, if there ever is a line drawn that says now fossil fuel expansion stops and we're going to close down fossil fuel infrastructure, this will strand a lot of assets, meaning it will destroy tremendous amounts of capital that is awaiting profit in various stages of valorization. There's all this capital that is sunk in these investments and that has a structural interest in keeping this infrastructure in place. And this, I would say, is the core of the structural resistance against any transition away from fossil fuels. There is simply so much money that would have to be destroyed on the day that you close down fossil fuels. And the problem is that the longer you wait with doing this, the greater this sum of capital grows, because in the meantime you have continued expansion. So if mitigation had started 10 years ago, it would have been impossible for Total to build ECOP now. But it didn't happen. And in the meantime, you've had all of these new fossil fuel projects all the time. You've had Norway inaugurating Europe's single largest oil field, discovered by a Swedish oil company. This oil field, Johan Sverdrup, has now been in operation for just a couple of years. It should be shut down now. But if it is, again, that would cause enormous financial pain to the Norwegian and Swedish owners of that oil field, as well as all the banks and other financial institutions that have put their money into it. So the longer we've waited with this mitigation, the greater the obstacle to it becomes, because when there is no mitigation, all these companies continue to expand their fossil fuel assets, which reinforces their interest in business as usual, which makes it even more difficult to mitigate, so that even more, you see the logic? Yeah. This is why we're in this ship. It's basically the reason. Because, and this is something that I wanted to return to the original discussion about the steam engine. The situation we are in now resembles the one of the original transition into fossil fuels, in the sense that the flow of energy, not water power, because that's not really the issue anymore. Now it's solar and wind. Solar and wind are across the board cheaper than fossil fuels. But we're not seeing a transition from fossil fuels to the cheaper sources of energy. Instead, we're seeing the large corporations, like I mentioned, BP and others, investing even more in fossil fuels, despite them being more expensive. That is because they generate so much more profit. So technically, it's easier now than it's ever been to do everything we already do in our economies without fossil fuels, with a few pockets of remaining difficulties, the main one being aviation. It's still impossible to drive airplanes on anything else than jet fuel. But virtually everything else can be done by energy from solar and wind. So the situation we're in is technically not necessary. It's not out of any kind of human needs or neutral ecological imperatives that we keep expanding fossil fuels. It's because they are sources of profit and they hold such astronomical amounts of sunk capital in their assets that this keeps happening.
Wow. It's quite difficult to read your work and feel optimistic. But at the same time here you try to insist on the immensity of the enemy and its properties and all of the fixed capital. But at the same time, in a matter you say it's also it's the weakness, because we know where to look for, and we know where to campaign to shut down new extraction, and there's a lot of ways to play out the struggle. But maybe because it's time, I'll let people in the room ask questions, and maybe this will get us to more optimistic solutions or proposal. I hope that it was not too heavy introduction to your work. So thank you, Andreas.
First of all, thank you very much for the introduction. So I would like to know, based on your readings, knowledge, and your different books, in your opinion, what's our possibility in terms of societal shifts that we could contribute, especially in the North, to perhaps start, say, a strong change in the way we modify the ecosystem. So basically, try to adapt to the Anthropocene and perhaps change the way we do in order to create a society that is more resilient and sustainable in the long term.
Well, so, I mean, you won't get much optimistic news out of me, I'm afraid.
Trying.
However hard you try. But we, of course, we always have to remember that we should expect the unexpected. One thing that I didn't talk about now, but that I've been very preoccupied with in the past few months, is the notion of tipping points in the climate. Because one of the problems of the whole idea of carbon dioxide removal is that if we go beyond 1.5, and then we hit 2, then we can go back to 1.5. And we can think of the Earth's climate as a thermostat in an apartment. If the apartment gets too hot, you just turn the thermostat down, and then you can breathe a sigh of relief and you're back to normal. And the idea is that you do the same with the climate of the Earth. It gets too hot, but then we go back. However, between 1.5 and 2 degrees, there are a lot of what science refers to as tipping points, which are these, well, limits or lines where just another small addition provokes a complete transformation of the system, which is irreversible. So, for instance, we're probably already past the tipping point for the West Antarctic ice sheet, which means that it's now too late to stop this ice sheet from melting. That doesn't mean that we'll have the 4 meters of sea level rise from that sheet realized in the next years, because it takes a long time for that ice to melt, but it means that this process might now have become unstoppable. It's a question of how fast it happens, but as such, it's unstoppable. And if the West Antarctic ice sheet melts, you can't just go back to 1.2 degrees of warming when the tipping point was crossed and the sheet will reappear. For the West Antarctic ice sheet to reappear, you would have to draw down CO2 so much as to hit a new ice age. That's when the ice sheet would start forming. Same with Greenland. The consensus right now is that the tipping point for Greenland is at 1.6 degrees of average warming. And like I said, February was 1.56. So we're very close to the tipping point for Greenland. If we lose Greenland, we have another rise in sea levels of 7 meters. And you don't get Greenland back by going below 1.6. To get the Greenland ice sheet back again, you need to remove so much CO2 as to have another round of glaciation. That's when the Greenland ice sheet will reform, okay? So all of these tipping points mean that the notion of reversibility in the climate system is essentially bogus. Now you can find all these entrepreneurs in the fancy carbon dioxide removal industry coming out of California saying, we're building a time machine. We are inventing all sorts of technologies for turning the Earth into a time machine where we can actually reverse climate change. But if you cross these tipping points, it's essentially impossible. If the Amazon turns into a savanna, it's going to be extremely difficult to get the rainforest back. That's another tipping point. We're just on this tipping point. You know, the Amazon has been standing there for 65 million years. It's about to flip into a savanna. Forest gone. Anyway, try to get your mind around that. The Amazon, an Earth without Amazon rainforest. Okay, this was even more pessimism from me. There is, however, a silver lining in this whole model of tipping points, and it is that there might be tipping points in society too. This is essentially old Lenin. Lenin said that the world develops by catastrophes and revolutions. Modern climate scientists have kind of rediscovered this logic without any kind of association with Lenin, of course. But they say that these tipping points that we see in natural systems, we can also see in social systems. So many of these researchers who look at climate tipping points are also trying to see, okay, might there be a sudden change in how societies deal with these issues and relate to nature? And tipping points are generally difficult to predict. And when the scientists are now coming up with predictions for where do these tipping points sit for Greenland, for the West Antarctic ice sheets, these are estimates. Because everyone has seen that once you cross 100 degrees, water starts to boil. But no one has seen these natural systems subjected to the forcing of ongoing global warming. So we don't know exactly how they are going to behave. So we can't predict. And it's the same, we've never been in this situation before of a climate crisis. So perhaps there is a tipping point somewhere, and it could be close, it could be tomorrow, who knows? Things happen in an unexpected way. And to quote Lenin, at least he's reputed to have said in very early 1917 that I'm not going to see the revolution in my lifetime. And part of this whole understanding of nonlinear transition, another, don't get me started on because I can give another rant for a long time, is that small tiny things can kick off major eruptions when you don't expect it. I mean, when Mohammed Bouazizi's self-immolated, no one would have known what that would precipitate. See what I mean? And this is the kind of hope that you can grasp for, that somewhere in our societies, at some point, something small can set off something very big. And we don't know what it's going to be. I mean, we didn't know when Greta Thunberg sat down at the Swedish Parliament towards the end of the extremely hot and dry summer that we had in Sweden in late 2018, that would kick off the largest wave of climate mobilization that we've seen in the global north. Now, we're in a very, very different position today. She was dragged from the Swedish Parliament today in a quite a humiliating way for her when she once again did this protest. But this just shows what a different position the climate movement is now compared to a few years back. Some of the differences being that the movement is very heavily criminalized. There's actually a very interesting symmetry between the Palestine Solidarity movement and the climate movement in the global north, and that they're suffering very similar kinds of repression and criminalization. And we're nowhere near the same kind of mass protest that we saw in 2018 and 19. What we have to hope for, if there's any rationality left on this planet, is that another season of disaster, such as the one that we're most likely approaching in the summer, or some other kind of climate disaster, triggers off a new cycle of contestation and protest like the one we saw in 18 and 19, but on another magnitude.
Yeah, if I can
Sorry for
no,
it's just one round after another. Yeah.
If I can just answer to what you just said. So if I can just answer to what you just said, I'm totally agree, first of all, for what you said about the ticking point, similar to ecosystem. And you said a correct point, you pointed out that current manifestation protests for climate crisis are criminalized. However, I would like to add that the problem, at least from my point of view, is that during those protests there is not necessarily a proposition of a different society.
Sure.
Perhaps there is, and that's exactly what I would like to know from you. If we're going to this tipping point, and it's likely that we're going into that, we're going to go somehow go after this. How can we already, with all the knowledge we have, all the technology that we have, create the society of tomorrow without necessarily predict the reaction of people and countries at a global scale, but how can we prepare the society of tomorrow after this stage that will be sustainable? And perhaps with this approach, this theoretical approach, perhaps then the protesters will be less criminalized because it will be more a political combat than just I'm against something. And I'm referring here about, for instance, permaculture, who is instead of criminalizing industrial agriculture, is just creating something new.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I know very little about permaculture, to be honest. I think in this country, a movement like Auteur has done a pretty good job in both opposing the megabasin and other types of destructive adaptation projects and agribusiness and fossil fuel industry as well, and promoted alternative forms of agriculture and hinted at a different future, a different society that relates in another way to the land. This is something that movements do around the world in thousands of different ways. We're not lacking alternatives. We're not short of ideas for how, or for that matter, short of technologies that could replace the most destructive ones. Not to say that 100% an economy run 100% on solar and wind wouldn't cause any kind of disruptions to natural systems, but it would be an incredible improvement of the kind of economy that we have now. It can be done, yes. But let me stress that I think if we're ever going to get a transition underway, an ecological transition, so at the core of it, away from fossil fuels to solar and wind as the main replacement for fossil fuels. This will not mean that we see the kind of society we want to see immediately. Any kind of transition is a process that starts in the dismal present with some kind of a rupture, some kind of a break, and sets in motion a process that goes beyond the present and points to something different. But the society that we want to see, which is going to be, among other things, an ecologically sustainable society, is the end station of that journey. And it's going to take a lot of struggle to get there. I mean, the struggle now is about maintaining the earth, as much of it as possible, in a habitable state. So it's really a minimum demand.
Anyone else? Any question?
The French Minister for Ecology is on record for saying that France should prepare for 3.5 degrees warming.
Mm.
How do you prepare for 3.5 degrees warming?
Yeah, bizarre. You know, this is another illusion that, okay, we've had a little bit more than 1 degree of global warming. This would mean that 3.5 will be 3 times as worse. But it will be much more than 3 times as worse, because this is not a linear process. Again, between here and 3.5, there are so many tipping points that will just make the world unrecognizable. And there's one thing that we really want to puncture in this book that we're writing is this illusion of adaptation, the idea that if we just beef up our technologies, we can buffer ourselves against these blows and adapt. And this has been quite prominent, I think, in Macron's reactions, at least his discursive reactions to the very bad wildfires in France. Perhaps not so much last summer, but the summer before that, when he has said things like, we need to have more planes to water bomb these fires when it gets warmer. And if we can do that, then we'll be able to adapt. And when it comes to wildfires, there are all these ideas that we're going to have various kinds of more powerful technologies to keep these fires under control, and we can have satellites that warn us in time when the fires happen and things like this. I think this is fundamentally delusional. The idea that the fires that will happen at 2 degrees or 3 or 3.5 are fires that we can keep under control if we only fortify ourselves or arm ourselves with powerful technologies enough. I just don't think that's going to work. These fires will probably consume the material for fires that there is, and then countries like France or Greece will turn into other kinds of biomes than forested countries. So they will desertify or become steppes or something. Now, obviously, I can't foretell exactly what's going to happen, and one kind of joker here, one kind of variable that could totally change everything in another direction is the collapse of the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, more popularly known as the Gulf Stream, which is also precisely its tipping point, according to recent science. And if it stops completely, if it just collapses, we could have a cooling in this part of the world by maybe 5-6 degrees in a decade, which would throw us in the other direction at extreme speed, and there's no way we can adapt to that. How are we going to adapt to French agriculture if temperatures plunge by 6 degrees over 1 decade? I don't think there's a technology that's going to be able to do that. And according to the most recent paper that came out, this can happen virtually any time because the AMOC is so slow.
Did you have any contribution?
Thank you very much for a very rich explanation. I have a question and kind of a doubt, which is, it sounds like it's the global south has pushed for 1.5. The global south is somehow more conscious of the dire consequences. But by virtue of being close to capitalism, and by virtue of capitalism being a global force now, Saudi Arabia, India, China, they're also involved in the capitalism. So do we still have a north-south divide? And it seems that it's not the case. It's not the case. So how do you work out this? And if there still is a north-south, the way it happened, and I absolutely agree with you that the genocide case on Gaza was brought forward because the global south has still a moral compass. We don't have that anymore. Now, is there anything brewing in terms of legality, of either the global south making a legal challenge to the catastrophe, or will the legal legislative process of enforcing, passing laws in each country, forcing the institution to actually stick to the 1.5, will have that effect? Or where are the possibility for legal challenges, litigation, etc., that will eventually force the institution not just to go along the financial capitalism for that fossil capitalism? Thank you very much.
No, these are very good questions. I received them as separate questions because you talked about different things. First of all, yes, you're right. I mean, the global south isn't this monolithic, angelic entity of climate awareness. That's absolutely not the case. India is a very important case in point, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because the far-right government in India is extremely cold positive in a sense, in a way that's very typical for far-right parties and governments around the world. Modi has had this campaign to unleash coal, and the coal expansion in India is just relentless. China obviously even worse. Egypt is terrible when it comes to fossil fuels as well. And I can go on. Algeria, Venezuela. In the negotiations, the general pattern is still that you get a north versus south divide in many of the key issues. Sometimes, for instance, you have India, as in the Glasgow COP, resisting any kind of talk about coal because they have their interest in coal. But the general pattern, not the least when it comes to negotiating over loss and damage, which is the key legal mechanism for some kind of compensation that's at least being discussed, and that was, loss and damage. Or the COP in Egypt was the COP where loss and damage was supposedly that the gain, the wins for the South came in loss and damage. So the principle is there that countries in the global South will be able to come to rich countries and say, look, we've lost this much because of global warming. We have suffered this economic damage, but it's because of emissions that you have made, so you will need to compensate us for it. Now, this principle has, of course, been resisted fiercely by the US and others in the global North who know that they will now have to pay. And the way things are going, the concept of loss and damage will open a Pandora's box of legal claims and conflicts. And, when countries in the global South undergo ecological destruction, we already see it happening. Think of a country like Iraq. People have no idea how bad the situation is in Iraq when it comes to the environment, when it comes to how the marshes that have been there for thousands of years are drying out, how low the water levels are, how this cradle of agriculture is collapsing because of global warming. And you could say that, well, Iraq itself has produced quite a lot of oil. Well, yes, that's why Iraq as a country has also been politically destroyed for decades. So first Iraq is destroyed because of the oil, and then it's destroyed because of climate change. These kind of disasters are playing out around in the global South, and when, can we imagine that those people who have perpetrated these catastrophes will actually at one point be brought to justice and pay for it? Well, we can imagine it, just as we can imagine that at some future Benjamin Netanyahu will be in the dock in The Hague, and he will have to answer for his crimes. There is there's a potential future of justice, but it's almost within the metaphysical imagination, if you see what I mean. I mean, do we actually believe that this is going to happen? Well, it's not along the lines of current events, but it could happen. And yes, let's hope that it will. I don't know if this was
No. I have one. You spoke about reducing CO2 emissions. You spoke about changing fossil infrastructures and about Switzerland that produce solar energy. What do you think about nuclear energy? And do you see a way with this type of energy that is kind of dangerous?
No, just one small clarification. Switzerland, it's not about solar energy, it's about solar geoengineering. What Switzerland said we should do is look much more into the technology, sometimes also referred to as stratospheric aerosol injection, which is the idea that, it's too hot on the planet. What can we do? Yeah, we can fill airplanes with sulfur and put them high up in the stratosphere and shoot out the sulfur, and it will then form a kind of an umbrella around the globe and block some of the incoming sunlight and therefore cut down temperature. Now, because of the situation we're in, you see more and more initiatives of this kind coming to the fore. So a version of this that has gained some attention recently is to construct a kind of a curtain midway between the Earth and the Sun. And this curtain will hang there in space and intercept some of the sunlight and therefore cool the Earth down. The advantage with this technology is that it is the only kind of technology that has the potential to reduce temperatures on Earth virtually overnight. So BECCS or whatever technology you have for carbon dioxide removal will have to run for decades before you see any kind of difference. And the great attraction and danger with solar geoengineering is that you could think of a scenario where politicians, could even be Donald Trump, because you don't have to attribute the problem of global warming to fossil fuels to undertake such an operation. But at some point, a politician of a lot of power will wake up and say, it's too bad. The fires in California now are just too bad. We have to do something and get this under control. What can we do? As in the early pandemic or something like that. Well, the only thing you can do to get it under control from 1 month to the next is to do some kind of solar geoengineering. This is what Switzerland proposed the other week that we should look more closely into. And it's coming up the agenda. Solar energy is a completely different story. Nuclear power. Well, my view on nuclear power has for a long time been what some refer to as the agnostic view, which is to say that it's not the solution, but it's not the problem. So it's not nuclear power is not a driver of global warming, but nuclear power is not a solution to it either. I think that what happened in Germany, for instance, when they shut down their nuclear industry after Fukushima and expanded coal, was disastrous. I think it would be disastrous if you did something like that in France, and you have much more nuclear power than what Germany did. Sweden and France are similar in relying on a lot of nuclear, although you have more than we do. In Sweden right now, we have a far-right government. The far-right loves nuclear, right? It's the situation here too, isn't it? Yeah. The far-right in Sweden controls the government, although it's not formally in the government, but it's the only political force in Sweden, really. And it loves nuclear power, and so there is this idea that we're going to massively expand nuclear power. And they do this while they're also planning for massively increased emissions from transportation. In general, the Swedish climate policy is Donald Trump climate policy, but on a Swedish scale. We don't need nuclear power to supply energy for us. It can be done much better with solar and wind. Solar and wind are the real alternatives to fossil fuels, and the reasons that we should expand them and not nuclear are several. One is that they're much cheaper, solar and wind. they're much faster to build. It takes forever to build a nuclear power plant, but you can build wind turbines and solar panels in no time. Nuclear power is itself vulnerable to the effects of climate change. You've had this situation during the hot summers in France where you haven't had enough water in the rivers to cool down the plants, so you've had to shut them down, right? There's no similar problem for wind or solar produced by global warming itself. And you don't have accident, wind turbines don't explode, they can't do it. I mean, nuclear power plants very rarely explode either or have meltdown, but the risk exists. It doesn't exist for solar panels. The wind turbines, there's no issue with the waste, so it should be solar and wind, not nuclear. That's the solution. But the environmental movement at this point in time shouldn't focus its forces on combating nuclear. So if the environmental movement should pick an enemy in France, it should be Total, in my view, not the nuclear plants.
Okay. No more questions?
Because I can have one. No, but I wanted to do, because between the first question and your work, I think I have some colleagues called quantitative. They work on the climate movement in France, okay? And they try to see what are the ideological stance of the different categories of people that are in the movement. And they show that you could, of course, see repartitions of different groups according to what are the material kind of capitals they're holding for themselves. And they show that the more people were having great capitals like diplomas, great wages, great position, the more they did buy into the technology and market economy is going to save us from the climate crisis. So I thought that was interesting because you said, what can we do? I think that you argue quite a lot on your new work that we have to do these ideas that technology and market economy are in any way a possibility of solution to the fossil industry. Because you didn't talk about it, but you said that the ending question of asset stranding is public property and owned by associated producers of energy flows. So
Yeah. You want me to say more about asset stranding?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the connection is again your Marxian very class struggle angle into the subject, because basically you say socialism or barbarism, and it's kind of a Boolean.
Yeah, well, the thing with asset stranding is that for instance, a company like Total cannot continue to exist as an oil and gas company. It should have ceased to exist as one a long time ago. And on the morning when any kind of meaningful climate action begins, a company like Total is doomed. And they know this. All the oil and gas companies know this. They have nightmares about it. And they try to deal with it in various ways. They try to preempt it and deflect it by saying that, we're now Total Energies, we're an energy company, we're doing all kinds of energy, while the core business remains oil and gas, and that's where they get all the profits from, and that's where they plan to expand. But they do all these token businesses on the side, what we refer to as greenwashing, and it works very well to defend their interests. At the core of it is just continued business as usual. Climate action from states means, by definition, asset stranding, or the political destruction of fossil capital. So, a lot of capital that has been sunk into fossil fuel infrastructure will have to go to waste. And a lot of stakeholders and banks will have to be informed that you can't make profit out of fossil fuels anymore. This seems to point towards some kind of public control over these companies, because once you have companies that collapse, that go bankrupt, that cannot continue to operate, someone will have to take over them. And of course, one of the optimistic scenarios here that some people have toyed with would be to nationalize a company like Total and turn it into a carbon dioxide removal company instead. So Total will be charged with the job of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Likewise with ExxonMobil and so on. The good thing here would be that a lot of the skills that the workforce in these companies already have could be repurposed for this. The technology here would probably be direct air capture, which is a technology for directly sucking CO2 molecules out of ambient air. But yeah, I mean, this would be the good scenario. It's some kind of a association of the direct producers, some kind of ecological socialism. But the trends we're seeing right now are not in that direction. And the trends we're seeing right now are all about coming up with various kinds of technologies for carbon dioxide removal, not the least, solid geoengineering as well. I mean, there was, for instance, there was a scientist just mentioned that there's almost an entertainment value in much of this because it's so absurd. But there was an Iranian scientist who proposed the other year in a paper, I don't know if it actually ever was peer-reviewed, I have to check, but it was out, and he argued that we can't control fossil fuels, but what we can do is we can attach the Earth to some of the asteroids that are, traveling through space, and we can kind of latch onto the asteroids and nudge Earth out of orbit a little bit away from the sun. So it gets cooler. And we're in this general cultural moment, or ideological conjuncture, where we've given up on the idea of bringing capital under control, and instead there is this exuberant technological imagination about everything else we can do instead. So another example, this comes from one of the top climate science journals. There was a paper published in 2022 by a group of researchers who argued that, okay, emissions are out of control, but we can put light bulbs on top of the rainforests. Rainforests naturally sequester CO2 through photosynthesis, but photosynthesis sleeps at night. But if you put these light bulbs on the Amazon, you keep photosynthesis going during night as well, and this will then sequester an enormous amount of carbon that can cancel for all the historical CO2 emissions. And they ended this paper with noticing, well, there might be a little problem because perhaps the organisms that live in the Amazon and other rainforests have actually adapted to the existence of night. So what's the jaguar going to do when suddenly there is this flashlight shining into its den in the night, or even the trees that this whole process would rely on? They're adapted to the diurnal cycle, so what's going to happen when there is no such cycle anymore? Maybe the whole entire ecosystem will collapse. And all these technologies that they're coming up with, there's no shortage of them. I've been looking into them just there. Well, for instance, the state of Israel is very good at doing this. The state of Israel is always on top of Western affairs. There are carbon dioxide removal companies based in the entity in the state of Israel that say that we cut down trees and we bring them on massive barges or whatever, and we sink them in the oceans and let them sink to the sea, to the ocean floor, just as wrecked ships have sunk to the floor and stayed there for centuries. We can dump carbon into mass graves in the sea, and this is how. It's just bizarre how many ideas are coming out for how we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And maybe some of them will work. Who knows? Maybe these Israelis will save us by planting trees and cutting them and then dumping them into the ocean. Or maybe something very, very bad will happen in some ecosystem somewhere once you start doing these things. But this is the absurdity of the moment when technological imagination has completely replaced political imagination.